My name is Aparna Polavarapu. I'm the Executive Director and founder of the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. I'm also a professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law. I just want to give a little bit of background on what SCRJI is before I jump into some of the substance. I founded SCRJI, the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative, just about 1 year ago. We're coming up on our 1-year anniversary, to respond to an unmet need in South Carolina for education and support in developing restorative practices. So, through my ongoing work and communication with direct service providers and community activists across the state over the past several years, it was really apparent that there was a desire and an interest to implement restorative alternatives to traditional modes of response to harm, right? But what's been missing is a support network that could equip providers with the knowledge and resources to begin integrating restorative practices in their own work. So I developed SCRJI to fill that gap. And we have a three-pronged mission. The first is to educate and promote dialogue in South Carolina about the concepts of restorative and transformative justice. The second is to facilitate the development of community-based restorative justice mechanisms. And the third is to just simply provide publicly available educational material. And you can always learn more by visiting our website or contacting me. So an overview of this presentation. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. That's, of course, you've probably all heard professors say this before, but it's always true. That's not nearly enough time to cover, the breadth and depth of the material. But I've carefully, curated what I think is most relevant for y'all. I teach a semester-long course on restorative justice, and I think, frankly, it should be a full year course, and even then it still wouldn't cover everything, but it would get it would cover a lot more and get people much greater knowledge and expertise. So I'll provide a very brief overview of the concept of restorative justice. And then I'm going to review 2 examples of restorative justice practice for youth who are attached to the criminal legal system. So again, because of time limitations, I'm only covering 2 examples. They are not the only examples. There are many out there. I chose these 2. I chose the first one, the family group conferencing in New Zealand, because it's foundational to many of the later restorative justice practices that were developed to work with youth. And the second one I chose is here in the United States, in California, because it has a significant presence and it continues to be evaluated. So we have a lot of material to look at, which hopefully will help answer some of your questions. Both of these examples are examples that work with the criminal legal system. And I did that because of the audience, right? And I understand exactly what you're looking for, but I just want to point out that there are plenty of examples that operate completely outside the system, that are not attached to schools, and they're not attached to the criminal system, right? So restorative practice can exist in many places, including just informally in communities. So let me start just by going through what restorative justice is. So I often use this graphic, and you'll note that on the upper left, I write that it is an imperfect graphic. So I really, really want to impress that upon you. This is imperfect, and it'll become clear why in a second. And this is an imperfect graphic of restorative justice. I do differentiate between restorative practice and restorative justice. So, there's a lot of similarities and they operate based on the same principles. But I consider restorative practice to include all of those practices like community building, peace building, anything that's just like daily check-ins that maybe don't necessarily respond to a harm that just occurred, right? Restorative justice, on the other hand, I use to describe practices that are put into place specifically to respond to harms, right? So I just differentiate the two because I do think that there is some difference in how they're implemented and practiced, and the discussion is going to be different. So the idea behind restorative justice is that the commission of a harmful act is a violation of the relationship between the people that are committing that harmful act and the community. It's an alternative approach to our criminal legal system. I mean, you'll notice already that I'm using different words. I don't use words like victim and perpetrator, which is something our criminal system does. And the reason is in part because restorative justice, again, has a more expansive understanding of harm, even when it is intertwined with the criminal system. We know that not all harms are crimes. And honestly, not all crimes are harms. So the focus is on what are the harms that have been committed. And we also understand that in a lot of cases, this can get really complicated because sometimes you have multiple harms being committed by all the parties, right? So it's hard to just differentiate into one group and another. And also, right, the restorative justice movement is gaining steam because it understands that sometimes for the parties involved, the criminal system isn't serving their needs. Right, so I call this an imperfect graphic because this is describing how restorative justice works in theory or a lot of times, but not all the time. So drawing from indigenous and global forms of justice, we conceptualize a process that brings together the people who have committed the harm, the parties that are affected by the harm, and community stakeholders. They come together. The process itself can look a number of different ways. And the end result, one of the end results, is that the person who committed the harm is being held accountable and that they hold themselves accountable. So we offer them support so that they can actually do that. Some of the differences from the criminal system. So again, the shift is from what law has been broken to what harm has been committed. It also allows for an unrestrained narrative. As you all know, people can't often don't just go to court and say everything that they want to say and everything that they're feeling, right? There are lots of rules. There's a strategy of the case. The restorative process makes room for that full narrative, for people to be able to talk from beginning to end about what happened, all of their different feelings, anything that they think is relevant, all of that is brought in, right? And then the emphasis at the end is not on punishment, but on the responsible party arriving at accountability. Okay, so let me talk about what accountability is. So at the end of a restorative process, we typically, a restorative justice process, our focus is on arriving at accountability agreements. And again, this is one of the key differences between regular community restorative practice and restorative justice. Accountability agreements are specifically tailored to the people who are involved with the harm, to the harm that has been committed, to our understanding of why that harm has been committed in this specific case. And in those agreements, you are seeking to repair that harm. How do we restore the people that have been harmed? It can also, and often does also, include steps that the responsible party will take to ensure that the harm will not be repeated. So it's hard to give a model and say, here's what all accountability agreements look like, but just as some examples, they really range. I talked with a professor in Milwaukee who is a Black man who entered into a restorative process after some drunk, white college students yelled some racial slurs at him. They also, one of them, I think, swung at him, which led to some bystander calling the police. This young man got arrested. The man, the professor who had experienced all this, was interested in a restorative process. The young man was also interested in a restorative process. After they went through all of the conferences together, they felt that one of the things that this young man really needed was education. So the the professor, the person who was harmed, actually said, like, I'm interested in maintaining a relationship with you as part of your accountability. So they entered into this long, like, educational agreement. This young man read a lot of books, had to write lots of book reports. He was also going out in the community and doing community service. So that, was a very unique kind of accountability agreement. Others have, the community service actually is pretty common, but others have to sometimes agree to engage in additional professional services. So this is similar to some of what you see in diversion. So you'll have people agree to go to anger management, to substance abuse treatment, to therapy to address specific issues. I mean, it can really run the gamut. And one thing I do want to make clear, I feel like when I talk to people, sometimes they think that restorative justice is just like a bunch of people talking about their feelings and then they hug each other, and then they walk away, right? Which makes it seem very light. It's not like that. Accountability is really, really hard. Accountability requires that you acknowledge what you've done openly. You say, I did this. You acknowledge the impacts of what you've done. And that you also experience natural consequences for that action. Consequences are real in restorative justice. The difference is that those consequences, again, flow from the action and are not necessarily, they're not a knee-jerk punitive response, right? So it's not just about you did something wrong, I have to punish you. It's you did something wrong, you should experience consequences, this person should be made to feel whole. And we need to talk about what's going to get you to a place where you're not going to do this again. And in a lot of cases, especially with youth, you end up also having to meet their needs in other areas that are not being met. Okay. So where have we seen these ideas before? Alex briefly mentioned this. We do, this like wasn't invented recently here. Restorative practice draws heavily from like indigenous justice. There are a number of restorative practitioners in the United States that have actually been trained by trainers from the Mohicans, the Navajo, the Ojibwe, so various tribal communities. I have argued elsewhere that we also have learned a lot from societies around the world, including Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. We've also seen it in transitional justice. So some of you who maybe are already exposed to this probably have heard about the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. That was inspired in some ways by restorative justice principles and by traditional justice principles in South Africa as well. And I always feel the need to point this out just because it's important to know, that this has long roots. Deep roots, and we're drawing from them again to try to find a more community-oriented approach to justice. Okay, so I keep referring to process, and I haven't said anything about what that process is. So the process can look a number of different ways, and I'll briefly cover some of these. I'll say that the two examples I'm going to give you call themselves conferences. In some ways, they almost leach into circles because there's so many people involved. But, largely with youth in the criminal system, we see a lot of conferencing. So conferencing is, it's a lot like what it sounds. It's bringing together a conference. So you have like people sitting around a table. It doesn't have to be a table, but you'll have the people who've committed the harm, the people who've been harmed. Oftentimes they bring their support people, family members, and various community stakeholders. When the legal system's involved, you will also sometimes have representatives from the legal system there. And they engage in the restorative process, right? They have open narrative. Everyone gets to talk about their perspectives, about what happened, why it happened. They dig into why it happened, and then they all come together to come to an accountability agreement. Circles are very similar. A lot of circles come with a lot of ritual, but they don't have to. And again, it's bringing, oftentimes I think of circles as usually having a larger group of people and a talking piece, but it, again, just doing the same thing. VODs victim offender dialogues are a form of conferencing. They're face-to-face conferencing. I separate them out because they're a little bit different, oftentimes because they're occurring with people who are already incarcerated. We don't have like support people in big groups of people. It's often a much smaller group. And again, slightly different because I see them a lot with people who are already incarcerated. There are some, they can occur at any point in the criminal process, and there are some that will be, occurring pre-charge. But again, it's the same idea. The person who's committed the harm, the person who's experienced the harm coming together and just really having a dialogue about it. And it can look any number of ways, right? The idea, though, is we're able to have a dialogue, we're able to talk about the harm, we're able to understand why it occurred, the impacts on the person, and get to accountability. So I'm going to move on to some examples. Before I do that, I'm going to say, I know I've been talking kind of fast and I've given a very brief overview. I'm cognizant of time, and I, again, try to just pick the highlights. But of course, let me know if you all have any questions, and I'm happy to dig into any of this more thoroughly. I am going to go more slowly through the examples, and hopefully that will illuminate more about how restorative justice can work. And so again, I'm specifically looking at restorative justice and youth in the criminal system. Restorative justice doesn't have to be limited to youth. And in fact, when I launched SCRJI, I expressly chose not to have, I launched an initial webinar series. It's an 8-part series. A number of them are posted on YouTube now. And I expressly chose not to have any that were focused entirely on youth, because I felt like people seem to think that once you're 18, you shouldn't get restorative justice, when in fact, we do use it for people of all ages and for all types of harms. And sometimes some of the most serious ones have been effectively addressed through restorative justice. So again, I just want to reiterate, there's like a much bigger world of RJ out there than what we're focusing on today. So I'm going to start by talking about family group conferencing in New Zealand. This is important to cover because it is really, it has been the model for a number of similar programs in other countries, including Australia, the US, and Canada. And to the extent, it's either been a direct model or it's been a direct model for an adaptation, which then served as the direct model. So it was introduced over a decade ago, and it was provided for by statute. And it's been heavily studied as well as a model by people around the world. So there's quite a lot to say on it. It's adapting, this process adapts Maori justice traditions. And I want to be clear that it's an adaptation. A lot of people like to talk about, and I do this too, a lot of people like to talk about restorative justice and talk about how it comes from Indigenous justice. But we do have to understand that there are some adaptations, right? Wholesale transplants don't often make a lot of sense. So we take the elements that make sense, we take what we understand, we take the lessons learned, and create something that works for us. So this, like I said, this system has adapted Maori justice traditions. In part, it was developed because of the overrepresentation of the Maori in the New Zealand youth justice system. And I'm going to stop for a second because I'm making an assumption here that y'all know who the Maori are. The Maori are an Indigenous people to New Zealand. So in New Zealand, everyone under 18 is sent to the youth courts. That's what they're called. And in the youth courts, most cases have the opportunity to go through family group conferencing. There are very few exceptions, and it's really offenses that are considered the most serious. But really, most of them, a large portion of them, really have the opportunity to go to family group conferencing. And the family group conference is arranged by a youth justice coordinator. So they have a position that is just for this. The Youth Justice Coordinator will reach out to the parties involved and ask, make sure that they're willing to participate. They will also ask whether any special customs should be included. And this is pretty important when working with this community, and may be important for you all depending on what communities you're working in, to make sure that I guess you're giving respect to whatever they feel they also need symbolically to feel that reparation has been made, that apology has been made. Because even though it might seem like something not important to you, if it's important enough to them as a way to show reparation, then it ought to be included. The FGC is attended by the young person, by their family, by the harmed party. If the harmed party wants to include support people, then they can also bring some support people. And also often by the police officer. Others are included as appropriate or as requested. So that can include, notice that the original group doesn't include lawyers. You can include your lawyer, and there it's known as the youth advocate. You can also include other people who can provide really important information about you. So sometimes these conferences will have a teacher, they'll have a doctor, they'll have a social worker, and then various other people who are related to those fields specific to New Zealand. So they have people called transition workers and youth workers. They might also be involved. And this always depends on who that young person is, what the harm is, what else they're bringing to the table, right? So real quickly, let me just talk about the general structure. So it starts out, right, with that young person taking responsibility for what they've done. That's what's happening at the outset. This is another thing that I think is pretty different from, like I said, restorative process, is that like we can't proceed with restorative justice if we don't have someone taking responsibility. It's a requirement, right? So this person has to acknowledge what they've done. If they cannot take responsibility, the conferencing stalls out, right? You might go back to having preliminary meetings and prep work, or you might just have to go to court, depending on how those conversations go. The group meets. They explore the underlying reasons for the actions. The harmed parties are encouraged but not required to attend. I should have said that. So the FGC, I had said, and on the slide it says, is attended by the harmed party. There are cases where they might not be able to come for any reason, but they're encouraged to attend and to discuss how they were affected, right? So to make it really clear, this is what you've done has hurt me, and this is how it's hurt me. And all of that goes back to you. This is why I say accountability is really hard, because this stuff is really hard to hear. As a group, the entire group decides how the responsible party can make amends for what they've done. So it's a consensus-driven agreement. So this can include, depending on the harm we're talking about, community service, getting a part-time job to help pay towards any damages, anger management, alcohol, drug support. And then they also set goals for the future. So what do we need for you? Do you need to be learning more life skills? Do you need safer access to schools, or do you need after school support? Do you need employment? Do you need access to get good mentor? So what do we need to get you to a place where you're not coming back? Most of these, what's interesting and different about these is these are actually like, there have been critiques of family group conferences. And one of them is that these can sort of follow like a template. A lot depends on who's facilitating and how good they are, to be honest. So some of these are as short as 1 to 2 hours, and sometimes it makes sense if we're talking about something really minor, but sometimes they should be a lot longer. In addition to reduced recidivism, one of the things that they've seen, of course, is also much, much lower burdens on the courts, because these are all going through family group conferencing. Okay, so now let me talk about Community Works West, which engages in restorative community conferencing. This is a group that is out in California. Their model is based on the New Zealand family group conferencing that I just described. It is a facilitated dialogue between the young person and the person they've harmed to create a plan to repair the harm, right? You can also bring in the same thing, support persons for each party and community members. It is attached to the criminal system. So we're talking about everything in terms of crimes, right? It's like once you've been arrested, then you have the chance to get referred to an RCC facilitating organization. So they often take serious crimes, and that's really what they look for. So that's why I wrote on the slide, you'll see the crimes addressed include a number of crimes, but they also include robbery, burglary, car theft, assault, battery, arson, and teen dating violence. So they're looking for people who are committing what are considered to be more serious youth crimes, as opposed to just like trespassing. And so the timing is, right, so after apprehension by either the police or by the school, right? So whoever has at this point said, we've identified you, you've done something wrong, that youth will then get referred to a nonprofit trained in the RCC model. So they can be referred by the school, by the police, by the DA. The way it works in California is you can also like go to your probation officer immediately from arrest. So probation can also refer you to the RCC model. And what happens is you haven't been charged, right? So this is all pre-charge, but the case is kind of in a holding pattern, right? So there's a potential to get charged if this is not successfully completed. So it's just sitting there. If you achieve successful completion, charges will be dropped. I mean, sorry, not charges will be dropped. No charges will be filed. If you haven't successfully completed, then you might end up back in the criminal system going through the traditional path, right? The process, right, is after the referral, the facilitating organization is going to reach out to the accused youth and their parents or guardians, and they reach out in writing. That's the first touch. It's always in writing. That's followed then by a phone call or a home visit by a facilitator to answer any questions and to invite participation in the program. So if that young person accepts responsibility, again, see how that's the linchpin. So if they're willing to do it, and if they are willing to accept responsibility, the same process is done with the harmed party, right? So once both sides agree to participate, we have the conference. Now, at a minimum, you're going to have 2 pre-conference meetings with either side. Minimum. There's a lot of prep in restorative justice. And you have these pre-conference meetings to make sure that it's appropriate for them to participate, to make sure that everyone feels safe, that you can create the right environment, but also to allow both sides to make their own assessment about whether this is right for them, to think about how their experience will be, what their needs are, and what the obligations will be by going through this process. So throughout the conference, you're going to have, again, this young person, the person they've harmed, and oftentimes up to 10 supporters, right? That's why I said this is almost more like a circle, because it's such a large group of people. And community members come together, discuss what happened, discuss why it happened, discuss the impacts, right? So everyone is supposed to be engaging in self-reflection. Everyone is supposed to hold themselves accountable. Sujatha Balaga, who was one of the people that participated in the development of this program and who I admire greatly in this space, has talked before about how to help people choose support people. And she has always said, you ask someone, who's your ride or die? Who's the person who's going to be on your side no matter what, and never tell you did anything wrong, but like always say yes, yes, yes? That person shouldn't be here, right? You need someone who like loves you, supports you, is your friend, but is also willing to tell you that you've been wrong. Right? And that can be a little bit hard to find, but those are the kinds of people you want in this conference. Right, and so you're also going to have apologies in this conference. And again, at the end, it's the same model, right? You're going to end with a commitment by the youth to repair the harm, to take the steps that they need to, basically to hold themselves accountable, but also commitment of others to help that young person do what they need to do, overcome those obstacles, mend social ties. So the result is this consensus-based plan. And again, the focus is usually like, how do I do right by the person I hurt, by my own family, by the community, and by myself, right? Thinking of all of these people, how do I do right by them? If they cannot come to an agreement on the plan, it goes back to the referring agency, so the police, the DA, the school. If the young person fails to complete the plan, it goes back to the referring agency. So like I said, it just loops back around to the system. So Community Works West has reported that sometimes the harmed party chooses not to participate in the plan development because they have expressed that what they really wanted was the opportunity to sit down and say, here's what you did to me, here's how it impacted me, I need you to understand this. And once they've done that, they don't feel the need to stick around. So they have had a number of experiences where the harmed party then chooses not to participate in the plan development. That being said, even though the plan is developed without them, they do have final approval over it. So the conference facilitator will give them a call when it's completed and say, here's what the plan looks like. Are you okay with it? Right? Because we want to make sure that they're okay with it. Sometimes the harmed party agrees with this process, but does not want to be present. And in that case, a surrogate is used. So they find someone who's experienced the same harm, who is willing to sit in that space, right? Because we do want to be centering the experiences of the survivors and making sure that we're not harming them. So ideally, I almost always write these programs will include a formal agreement with the, in California, the district attorney, stating that all communications that are made during the Restorative Community Conference, any communications and paperwork that's done in preparation for the conference, and anything that is said or written during the completion stage are confidential and cannot be used against the participants outside the conference process. And I phrase this as ideal, but realistically, I think most people will not proceed if we can't have that kind of agreement, right? And we need this because you want complete honesty, right? Taking responsibility is very scary, but if you also know that the prosecutor is going to turn around and just take everything you've said and use it against you, you're just not going to do it. So all of this, and I will also say this isn't just about encouraging the participation of the person who's done it, but also this is necessary to encourage the participation of people who do want to hold youth accountable, but are not willing to engage with legal systems, because there are a significant number of those people and they want a process out there. So this is something, so RCC actually works for, the people who were willing to call the police and also the people who weren't. The RCC facilitator monitors the plan during the completion stage, and it's usually completed in about 3 to 6 months, but again, that's very plan specific. Once the plan is completed, the case is closed, charges were never filed. Okay. One of the reasons I really like to talk about this program is because they've also done a lot of evaluation, and it just helps you see the impacts of RCC. So here is some data specifically on restorative community conferencing in Alameda County, California. So this is in a report that was published in 2017, but and it looked over the course of several years. They found that recidivism rates over time, right, that recidivism of youth that went through the restorative community conferencing was actually lower than those who did not. And you'll also notice that the gap between those rates increases. So, as we're looking 18 months out, we're seeing not such a huge increase in the RCC youth, but a much bigger increase in the control group. So this graphic, right, talks about recidivism rates for cases of person crimes, and you'll see a much bigger gap between the RCC youth and the control group. And let me just give you some data on what we're talking about here. So as of 2017, 62% of the conferences involved felony crimes. So the most common were robbery, burglary, vehicle theft, battery causing GBI, grievous bodily injury, possession of marijuana for sale, and felony theft. Less common were assault with a deadly weapon, sexual battery, arson, and then any crime that was related to carrying or showing a deadly weapon that was not a firearm. Now, they did, again, 62% were felony crimes, right? So they did have less serious crimes as well. Those included like vandalism, fighting in schools, like credit card theft, smaller scale property damage and vandalism that might have been related to bigotry or hate. What they noticed when they were evaluating their own programs was that when they were comparing person crimes versus just like traditional property crimes, the reduction in recidivism rate for the person crimes was actually greater. And so they see this as supporting their view that RCCs are most successful when you have cases that are more personal and have a direct victim, so that people can really see how they've harmed another person directly. But still, across the board, regardless of the crime, we are seeing a reduction in recidivism. So sorry, I think I skipped something. No, okay. So victims were surveyed also to ask how they felt about the experience. And, largely they felt that it was great. Like the lowest number was the plan addressed the impact of the offense was 88%. This is like the data is a little bit limiting here, if I'm going to be honest, because it required victims to fill out surveys. As I've said before, a number of the victims left before the end of the conference because they had expressed verbally that they felt happy, that they had done what they wanted to do, that the conference could proceed without them, and they didn't need to be involved. So the percent response rate is not super high, but they also have anecdotal evidence on top of this suggesting that everybody's been pretty happy with the conference. Another follow-up was to look at how the accused youth were impacted by the RCC. And these were actually reported by them and parents. So they showed improved communication, improved family relationships, improved conflict resolution. Parents identified that they saw that 47% saw better, significant improved performance with curfew, substance abuse, communication, school attendance, and school grades. I'll also add that recently, and I don't have a link to it here, but it's very easy to find, and we posted on Twitter about it a little while ago. There was a report that came out that was written by my friend Talia Gonzalez and was published by the Georgetown Center on, I think it's like poverty law and inequality, that also showed significant positive outcomes for youth in schools, especially girls of color, in a lot of these same areas when they were able to experience restorative practice. So we are seeing real improvement of the lives of people who are committing these harms through the use of restorative practice. So some final considerations I want to cover before I stop and see if y'all have any questions. There are some things we need to think about as we start thinking about whether or not we want to implement restorative practice and incorporate them. And one of them is like, we need to really try to avoid over institutionalizing restorative justice to the point where it stops being restorative justice. So I've noticed, especially lately, that there are many more government and school initiatives that use the label restorative justice to describe something that is not. This really requires a shift in philosophy, in like the way you think about harm, in, it's not just a process shift. So it requires being really deliberate and intentional. I saw something in Minnesota, for example, where lawmakers, they passed a law and it was called restorative justice, something, something. But it was not restorative justice. It basically involved, the judge looking at the defendant saying, you need mental health care, we're going to commit you to a hospital, and I'm going to get progress reports from the doctor, right? Like none of that in there looks anything like what I just described. That is, an alternative to sentencing, but it's not restorative justice, right? So we've got to be really careful. I think like as soon as a term becomes popular, people try to stick it on everything, and it's dangerous. So who should be present and how can their presence affect the process? I think this is something that is really important to think about. There's a reason why in New Zealand, the family group conference is outside the court, right? The issue leaves the court and goes to a separate space. With Community Works West, right, once the referral goes to an outside organization that is trained in restorative conferencing. So having the right facilitators, you can't, like, restorative justice court is not a thing, right? It's got to happen outside that. And also thinking about like how, sometimes we can't avoid lawyers or court officials being present, but really carefully thinking about what that presence means. How does that impact people's willingness to speak? And it does. Right. So being careful and thinking through who should be present, to what degree they should be present, and how they can get the information. I know we're talking about youth, but there's this great model for partner violence in Duluth that, again, gets also a lot of referrals from courts. And the way the prosecutor stays involved is they don't show up to circle, but they'll just hear about what happened periodically from the facilitator. Right. And then sometimes, depending on what the progress reports are saying, they might come in and actually meet with the survivor again, or the judge, might have an order to see the offender again, but typically they stay out of the process. Of course, it is a very, very well-developed process, and there's quite a bit of trust in that. And I also want to say community options must be available. Restorative justice can and does exist completely outside the justice system, the criminal system. And there are people who will not seek out any sort of restorative program if they have to go through the system to get to it, right? There are a number of people who will avoid like our systems at all costs. So we also need to be supportive of these community options that provide pathways for those folks. All right, so I'm going to stop here and just say, we do have a web presence with a lot of information. So you're welcome to follow us there, especially the YouTube channel, where we do periodically post some of our past webinars, and then on Twitter, where we will periodically, when we see good resources, we'll post those as well. Realistically, I'm not awesome at social media, so like Instagram and Facebook, I just kind of do as a off thing when I remember. And I'll stop now and see if anyone has any questions. I guess I should, oh, okay.
Hi, I'm Stacy Coleman I'm in the Public Defender's Office in Rock Hill. I was just wondering what the cost of the program is.
Well, cost will be specific to what exactly it is you're trying to do. And I don't have the information with me, but at least Community Works West has actually reported on their costs, and the source is on those slides that I gave. And they've reported that it's actually less expensive to do their programming than to go through the system and then also be paying for detention and everything. So overall, I think in terms of financial resources, you end up saving money. It can be more time intensive, especially depending on the harm and depending on what we're talking about. These conferences can take a while, and the pre-conference prep can take a while. But again, that's being done. That should be being handled by people completely outside the system, right? By organizations that are that have the skills for this. So it wouldn't be a drain on the courts for that, for that to happen as well.
Where would we start? Like, let's say there is a jurisdiction and there are people that are interested, and then, I worry that we'll kind of go back to our daily routine of just dealing with cases as they are, and because we don't know what to do next. What are some of your suggestions as to, some follow-up steps?
It is really overwhelming, especially because this requires like a real fundamental shift in approaches. I'll tell you what I'm doing with some other people here who are interested in starting up restorative practices. We've been having conversations, getting the right stakeholders involved. And what I've said to them is, what I can do, I mean, this would require getting additional grant funding and just to make sure we've got the time and the staff, because this is like my second unpaid job. We're at the point where we are now able to like research various programs and provide sort of comparative analysis. Like, here are a lot of different options. Here are the ways that this has worked in other states. Here's the path we recommend for you, right? And I'm doing this right now with people who are working in the space of partner violence and sexual violence. That, of course, takes some time on my end. Their job is to get all the stakeholders together and to start thinking through like who we might contact for funding to get this type of thing off the ground. Once we get past that research phase, we would then have conversations about, I would share all of that. We would talk about what makes the most sense, what also works in each particular system that exists within the state. And then we would have to find, a place to house it, and I would be bringing people in to do skills training, right? So that's something I see myself doing with people here, is walking them through the process of building this practice. So ideally, the people, the defense attorneys, the solicitors, the judges, the advocates, and all other levels who are interested, wouldn't have to do the actual building so much, but we would need their support, and we would need to understand like what y'all would need to do to make this the referrals happen, to make sure that we're able to make this work in a way that makes the most sense. And then also, of course, serving as partners to like raise funding for it, because that's the big issue. I have been asked if I am willing to facilitate restorative justice processes, and I give a cautious yes, like I am, but I can't do that many realistically. Like, what I want to see is to have people trained in the state in restorative justice, so that we can have like a good cadre of people to pull from who are willing to do this work, right? So I'll do one-offs here and there, and that's about it. I am working on getting some more training done with with just various people here who are already like restorative practice, or in restorative practice or restorative practice adjacent. I mean, it's going to take a while to build this up, if I'm being totally honest. Like it's, not going to happen tomorrow, but I'm working on getting some restorative justice training for some of our community mediation centers here in Columbia, in the upstate. And I haven't talked to the one in Charleston yet, but I've heard through the grapevine they're interested. I'd like to say that in a few months, it would be easier for me to make those referrals than it is today.
As far as DJJ is concerned, I mean, young people, this is geared toward them facing the people that they may have harmed, so that perhaps it prevents, repeat offenders and that type of thing. I think this would be fabulous for them to actually be confronted by the people that they've harmed, and so that's the main aim. Is that correct?
I mean, I always describe it as the aim is for them to arrive at accountability, and accountability is like complex, right? So it's about repairing the harm, taking responsibility for the harm, which I think is what you're getting at, right? So like really owning up to it. I did this and I hurt someone by doing this. And then taking steps to make sure that they don't do it again. We do like them to be able to face that person that they've harmed, but it is also important to center the survivor. So that does mean they may not be able to face that person. It might have to be someone who's sitting in as a surrogate because the person who's been harmed is not ready for that, or doesn't want to do it, or has said like, I've moved on, I'm tired of this. I can't have this conversation and be brought back to this place. Yeah, I'd say that that's really like, it's a 3-part goal.